Hello, folks. So we are moving into a new unit this week or through this month on Native Americans. And actually, it's kind of timely because we're in Native American History Month. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the early colonial history, and we're going to get into some discussions about the types of thinking from Indigenous scholars and current issues in the next week's lecture. So bear with me as we get through a lot of history. We're going to try to unpack, a couple hundred years worth. So I've tried to condense it and make it pretty concise. So we'll get into it and take a look at some of the stuff. So first, so I want to cover Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to think about the types of civilizations that were here, particularly the origin points of when we started to see folks in the Western Hemisphere and how that erupted into these major Native civilizations. I'll show you some examples of Indigenous architecture and communities, interconnections between Native peoples, notable Native scientific advancements, first contact between Natives and Europe, and then obviously the decline of Native societies that was a result of that contact. Our key term for today is going to be anachronistic. And we want to think about anachronistic because it's this idea that we've placed Natives within this sense of them always being stuck in the past. So Indigenous communities in the United States, and I'm not saying we as a collective, but I want to always kind of mention this in a very concise sense, is that we see Natives as these ahistorical people that didn't have necessarily science, language, history, so on and so forth. And were just a part of this kind of pre-civilized or prehistoric past. And what you'll learn about through this lecture is that Indigenous communities had been in, the Western Hemisphere for thousands of years, had actually had elaborate social dynamics, living environments, science, medicine, a bunch of other things that are really definitive of how advanced these communities were. And actually, I would argue in many ways that the Europeans who came across, their cultural, scientific, and cultural and scientific backwardsness, in addition to their reliance on a very dictatorial sense of religion, caused a friction between the two societies. And actually, at the end of the lecture, we're going to see that biological warfare actually was one of the key factors that led to the demise of Native peoples. So first, we have to understand that much of our understandings about Native peoples has been developed through a colonialist framework. And this is, we want to understand, and we're going to see this over time, that we perpetually see Natives as, again, this kind of subject of history that has never been advanced nor has progressed with time, in an effort to one, justify the conquest of land, and also the further marginalization of Native peoples, whether that be through the mascots, which we'll talk about in later units, or just the way in which we've constructed Natives within the context of race. The idea that Native peoples were never fully human, fully civilized, so on and so forth, has led to this, or I should say, enabled colonists to take their land and their bodies, for that part, with impunity, right? And so again, we want to think about this term anachronistic in this moment, in the sense that we don't fully see Natives as modern people or modern peoples, rather that they are these kind of prehistoric, or this prehistoric society that didn't have the qualities of Europe, right? And as we'll see in this first video, that's not the case. That actually these indigenous communities actually had elaborate societies with a variety of social and technological advancements that rivaled or actually put them far ahead of European society.
Hello, Internet. Archaeologists are finding that the Americas before Columbus were very different than we initially believed. New discoveries in a wide variety of fields are finding that long-standing concepts of the pre-Columbian world are very different than what we thought. So what has changed? First of all, the population of the Americas was way higher than even the most generous estimates we had before, and earlier than we thought. There was not simply one migration over the Bering Strait, but many migrations, and not all of them over the land bridge. Some of them came from Polynesia, which I discuss here, and some came by boat. The estimates now put the pre-Columbian population of the Americas as high as 100 million people. Our earlier estimates of when the first humans came to the Americas comes from carbon dating of the earliest human remains we can find. However, doing these tests again, as well as genetics of those living in Siberia, show that the 13,000 year ago estimate might be off by as much as 10,000 years. We think that the exposure to European diseases moved ahead of the Europeans and gave them a warped view of what populations were like in the Americas. We also now believe that diseases played a bigger role in the decline of native societies than warfare with Europeans. For example, people for a long time thought that horses helped Francisco Pizarro beat the Incas. When you look at where the Incas lived, up in the mountains, relying on stairways, you immediately see the issue here. Second, the level of cultural advancement and settlement range of native groups was much larger than we thought. Partly to blame is that many innovations came from Mesoamerica or modern-day Mexico, but their geographic isolation meant that not a ton of their technologies left the region. That inability to share ideas and access to large beasts of burden hindered many developments that Eurasians had access to. Take, for example, our ideas about guns. We commonly think that European colonists bringing guns gave them a huge advantage. In fact, natives mocked these noisemakers, which were loud, cumbersome, and much harder to aim than a bow and arrow. The famous John Smith, yes, that John Smith, wrote that, quote, "The awful truth, it, the gun, could not shoot as far as an arrow could fly." Another great example would be the genetic miracle that is corn. Maize developed from an inedible grass, but native farmers genetically engineered it through selective breeding into the huge varieties of corn we have today. And if you don't live in Latin America, you really don't know how crazy cool varieties of corn have developed. This led to the rise of civilizations like the Olmec. Other technologies of native societies surpassed what Europeans had. Moccasins, for example, were more comfortable and sturdy than European boots. Everyone wanted them because the padding made them move silently, which helped in hunting and in war. Canoes were faster and could maneuver better than any European small boats. Lastly, the New World was not the wilderness we imagined it was. Native groups across the Americas shaped the ecology to their benefit, mostly through the use of selective fires. Take the Mayans, for example. Many blame their collapse on the overloading the carrying capacity of their environment, showing that they had huge impacts on their surroundings. There's plenty of evidence that many native groups use slash and burn techniques to shape the landscape to their needs. Burning down forests encouraged grasslands that could be cultivated or attract game animals. They domesticated fewer animals and cultivated plants in a different way than Europeans, but no less intensely. European settlers simply were unable to appreciate this, likely due to language issues and good old-fashioned racism. This has been going on for so long that natives became a keystone species in the ecosystem, and the mass deaths from disease actually led to huge ecological changes to the continent still happening today. Their decline likely led to large population explosions for bison and passenger pigeons, as well as the reforestation of most of the continent, all in time for the Europeans to show up in a region and claim that the natives weren't using the land. As the inspiration for this video, Charles Mann said, they used the entire continent as a garden. These
So as we can see, natives actually had a quite significant impact on the continental region and were in this area for a significant period of time. And as we walk through this lecture, we're going to see more of what this looks like as we unpack this type of this particular history. So again, we see that Homo sapiens originated about 200,000 years ago, right? After global migration begins, we see people moving across, all over the world, essentially from Africa to the Americas, right? And then, at that same time, we also see around 20,000 years ago, humans starting to make their way across to North America, also, are by the Bering Strait, and then also by boat, right? And there's significant evidence now showing that contact with North America by humans happened both by boat and by foot travel. And our earlier understandings of Columbus being the first individual in the New World has been corrected, as we've seen, or we've come to learn that Vikings were in the Northeast region far before Columbus. There were African explorers also in Central America, and even Asian and Polynesian explorers in the western coast regions of North America and of Mexico. With that, we started to see a vast outcropping of civilizations with completely different dynamics, including language, cultures, spiritual practices, so on and so forth. The map here on the right gives you a sense of the regionality, and then obviously all of the names here are the different tribal groups. And I know it's probably hard to read some of those, but I just want to give you a kind of sense of the veracity and diversity in terms of those cultural or all the different indigenous communities in the region, and then obviously the different cultural groupings depending on their specific climate. And one thing to note is all indigenous communities essentially adapted to their regions and made lifeways around this, meaning that those that lived in the Arctic North, were fishermen, hunted seals, and lived in igloos, so on and so forth, right? Where you had folks in the arid desert living in caves, using irrigation and other forms of practices to raise livestock. You had a lot of tropical communities that did fishing and some hunting, as well as fishing and hunting, as well as obviously agriculture. So this is really huge. And one of the things that's very instrumental and integral to a lot of this is the domestication of corn, as was mentioned in the previous video, which we're going to see a little bit more of in this video here, right?
Often when we think about the beginning of American history, we think 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, or maybe 1492 when Columbus arrived in the Americas. But the history of America really begins about 15,000 years ago, when people first arrived in the Americas. In this video, I want to provide a very brief overview of Native societies before contact to give you an idea of just how diverse and complex these societies were as Native groups adapted to and interacted with their environments. Now, there's recently been a scholarly debate about how people first arrived. We know that maybe 12,000 years ago, during an ice age, the sea level was lower. And so a spit of land in between the Americas and Asia was exposed, over which people may have traveled. But recent archaeological evidence suggests that people were perhaps already in the Americas at the time of this ice age. So it's possible that they may have come earlier in boats. Now, however it was that they arrived, they spread north and south and east throughout the Americas, so that by the time that Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, there were perhaps 50 million people. That's kind of a mid-range number for the estimates that historians have made living in the Americas. And of those, 4 to 6 million were living in North America. So how did these societies develop? Well, a really big moment was around 5000 BCE, when people in Mexico domesticated corn, maize as it's also known. And domesticating maize meant that people who had originally been hunters, gatherers, following herds of animals, could partake in settled agriculture. So they could develop villages, complex societies. This isn't to say that they stopped hunting or gathering, but they began staying in one place. So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of the major societies in these regions. Native American societies developed around their natural environments using the resources that were available to them. For example, the Southwest Plains and Great Basin, quite dry, a lot of desert. And so societies in these regions adapted to the dry climate in several ways. For example, Native American groups that lived on the Great Plains continued their hunting and gathering way of life, hunting bison and following the herds of animals in teepees, which were dwellings that were easy to set up and then take down. People in the Southwest, like the ancestral Puebloan people, dealt with this dry environment by creating very complex irrigation projects so that they could water their maize crops using what little moisture there was. The Puebloans lived in large cave complexes as agriculture allowed them to grow their population. In the Northwest, fishing in the Pacific Ocean gave Native Americans a plentiful source of food, while farming allowed the Mississippian peoples to develop large settlements like Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, which at its peak may have had as many as 25 to 40,000 residents. The Mississippians and other East Coast Native peoples relied a lot on what's known as three-sister farming, in which people would plant corn, beans, and squash together, which was mutually beneficial to all three plants, as the corn served as a trellis for the beans, and the squash protected the root system of the corn. All three together create a very nutritious diet, which allowed for relatively high population density on the East Coast. So by the time that Europeans began to arrive in the late 1400s and 1500s, Native societies had been evolving for over 14,000 years. But the introduction of European people, pathogens, plants, and animals would introduce an unprecedented amount of change in the Americas.
Okay, so the invention of agriculture as a science and practice allowed these natives to develop these complex societies. And one thing that's integral to this is that once you can have a centralized food source, it's very easy to build your communities around that. And this is very important when we think about areas of, the indigenous Americas, i.e., the Aztec Empire with Tenochtitlan, Cahokia was mentioned in there. There's also Chaco in New Mexico, and there's lots of different examples of indigenous societies being able to develop these vast, cities based upon this. And so, like with other communities around the world that were much more advanced and had these types of things, we also see this with natives. So it wasn't something to apart from their societies, but actually very foundational. And actually, by the time Europeans got there, they had been evolving for tens of thousands of years, basically. And these early societies followed different types of leadership models, which we'll see a little bit later, but really were much more ecologically oriented. I don't expect you all to know these terms, but I wanted to introduce them here. There's this difference between patrilineal and matrilineal. And actually with a lot of what we're going to see later in this lecture is this idea of how matriarchy was very big in indigenous societies, but they would follow this kind of sense of either power and social organization following the father's bloodline, this patrilineal, or matrilineal based upon kinship with the mother. And this sensibility actually informed a lot of the ways in which they used democracy. And as we'll learn next time, there were a lot of different confederacies between tribal nations that followed social democracies that actually helped to inform the way in which the United States structured our democracy. Here we can see some examples of those early buildings, right, and societies. And so one thing to note with a lot of these is that they're very vast, right? So whether we're looking at the Northeast here, we can see agriculture, we can see the long houses of the Haudenosaunee, prayer circles, so on and so forth, right? There's a vast kind of city setup, right? These are not prehistoric societies, but actually very complex for their time. Here we can see another example of the Haudenosaunee longhouses, right? They have their own fencing, a type of turret and guardsmanship, right? Very protected off. Here's another example of Cahokia, big houses with thatched roofs, this big pyramid structure here. An example of the Puebloan people with a kind of adobe edifice, right, that are multi-story. So again, very complex in terms of their architecture. This is that city-state Chaco that I mentioned, very huge, right? You can still see this in New Mexico, multi-story, right? Hundreds of thousands of people living there, or several thousand people living here. And one thing to know, even with the Pueblans here down in the South, these are example of like Yaqui and Apache cave dwellings. Again, these are carved into the rock. So, people went into these caves, built these structures out of brick or built into the environment, which takes a lot of doing, right, physically and both intellectually. So again, the domestication of corn around 5000 BCE allows for this flourishment or this expansion of native societies, which again critiques the way in which we think of indigenous peoples, or where the American society has tried to cast indigenous people as these hooping, hollering, teepee, dwelling types of indigenous people. Rather, right, they have these kind of complex social systems and societal structures. So these native societies grew to have massive populations prior to Columbus. And the best estimates that I've seen is that there were around 112 million native peoples in the Western Hemisphere. So that's from the northern tip of Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of Chile, right? So we have to consider all of that as Native Americans, right? Although America has kind of taken ownership over the concept of American, really all people of the Western Hemisphere are, of the Americas, right, or American. I wanted to mention a couple of notably large cities. Again, Chaco, which I mentioned, is in New Mexico. It had a population of about 25,000 people. So, relative to a small or a fairly large city here in the United States. Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and also the capital of Mexico, right, had 250,000 people. So again, a fairly large city. And then Cusco, Peru, which was in South America, had 150,000 people. So again, massive populations here in these systems. I put in a couple small scientific advancements here, or a couple small cultural advancements here, which we'll explore a bit more in a minute. But if you see this top piece, this is actually in aqueduct system that's from the Northeast, developed by the Mississippian Indians. Here we can see an example of a rendition of medicinal practices. So, folks laying out on a bed, being healed by healers, right? There's individuals smoking a peace pipe, right? And there's a lot, this is the kind of pre-health system, or the health system of indigenous people. And then lastly, you can see an example of indigenous people playing lacrosse here. And it's very important for us to recognize that indigenous people in this environment had a lot of opportunities to develop, not only scientifically, socially, but also culturally, and had some great recreational sports as well. Lacrosse is one of them, right? Cross-country running was a big thing for indigenous people. Basketball, soccer were also huge, and surfing, right? So, we see a lot of, and we want to also consider that Native Hawaiians were a part of this kind of framework. So all of these different cultural advantages emerged, prior to Columbus, and have been practiced for thousands of years. I just want to show this quick clip that will explain a bit more.
Prowess of the people of the region. When most Americans think about North and South America before European arrival, they tend to think of scattered tribes of Native Americans. They imagine a people that lived nomadic lives and were greatly limited by their rudimentary technology. American historian and author Charles C. Mann challenges these preconceptions and invites readers to imagine a vastly more sophisticated group of people in his book, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. Mann argues that, based on the evidence, some newly discovered, the land from present-day New England to South Carolina was covered with farms built by the Native Americans. These farms would be on cleared, flat land. Nearby, a large wooden wall would be in place to protect densely populated encampments. Further south were enormous stone chiefdoms. Tenochtitlan was a city larger than the European centers in London or France. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Empire between the 1300s and 1500s, and its ruins are still visible in Mexico City. Just outside of Tenochtitlan was Lake Texcoco, a huge artificially constructed set of islands demonstrating the technological prowess of the people of the region. Continuing south to the Inca Empire, you would see that it was the largest nation-state in existence at the time. The same swath of land in England would stretch from Stockholm to Egypt. A piece of land that large proves how dense the populations in America were prior to Columbus's arrival. The reason Mann postulates that European explorers were ignorant of how vastly populated the Americas were is disease. One of the most deadly diseases was smallpox.
Okay, it looks like we're not going to be able to watch this whole thing. Well, I'm going to move on just because I didn't realize it was going to kick me out of here. So anyways, as we can see, there is a lot of knowledge here in these societies. And so in addition to these technological advancements, there were huge interconnection between these communities. And this is discussed at length in the article that you read this week, or the chapter you read this week by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz called Follow the Corn. We can see these trading routes up here coming from Mexico all the way up to North America and spreading across the region. The other thing to note with this is that these communities lived fairly decently in harmony. Although there was conflicts, there weren't the type of outright wars that we saw. And these cultural exchanges allowed, one, for scientific advancement, and also for the sharing of goods across spaces. And what archaeologists and scientists have found, archaeologists and anthropologists have found is, examples of feathers and other artifacts from various parts of the world and other places. For example, tropical bird feathers from Mexico and Central America, and headdresses up in the northern United States region for certain ceremonial tribal dresses, right? And so there was a vast kind of cultural exchange, and Native peoples had existed, fairly, well, much prior to Columbus. And we can see an example of an indigenous market here in Mesoamerica, right? There are several notable scientific advancements that also we should be cognizant of, that again show the level of advancement here in in Native societies. So we've talked a little bit about agriculture, right? So there's been this sense that Native Americans were able to domesticate corn, beans, squash, and other staple foods, right? We know that chocolate comes from the region, tobacco comes from the region, cotton comes from the region. So we have a lot of different types of agricultural goods that are, developed here. Animal husbandry was also very big. Although we did not breed, although Native Americans didn't breed bison, they hunted them. There were examples of dogs, other types of livestock that they domesticated as well. Fishing and hunting was very huge. Obviously, in the Northwest, this is very key with the fishing of salmon and obviously the capturing of other types of animals. And then obviously the capturing and curing of meats was very prominent in that it helped many indigenous societies live, or domesticate and live well. We also saw that forestry and land management was a part of this, right? And so this idea that Native societies actually were using prescribed burns or burning down forests in a way to help shape the landscape in an effort to either enable agriculture or, entice game, shows their level of, scientific ability. In terms of travel, they were the first to develop kayaks and canoes, so these small maneuverable boats that could get through, both seaways and various freshwater waterways. And also cable suspension bridges. Additionally, we obviously see that within their building, they had multi-story edifices, pyramids, so on and so forth. In terms of medical and health, they were able to develop medicines to treat infection, used for contraception. So they actually had the first forms of oral contraceptives and pain relievers. Modern day aspirin is actually an indigenous invention. It comes from tree bark. They both had forms of surgery and dentistry, and even developed syringes and oral mouthwash, which enabled their ability to live longer and healthier lives. And then what was very key to a lot of this, and actually what put them into a bad situation when there was European contact, was that Native societies practiced daily and ritual bathing. And bathing was very key for almost all Native American societies, and their level of hygienics or their level of cleanliness when in contact with these medieval diseases that were often bloodborne or fecal-borne, set them up to, one, get these infections very rapidly and not have the ability to develop immunities to them until much later. And so this contact actually made it very difficult for them to fight off, smallpox, diphtheria, typhus, scarlet fever, so on and so forth. They also use sweat baths for health and spiritual bonding, right? So our modern sense of saunas and those kinds of things actually come from indigenous communities. And then obviously clothing and materials are really big too. Up in the Northwest, Inuit and Eskimo communities were able to develop snowshoes and even snow goggles to help them see and obviously travel in those difficult regions. And then they also developed rubber because most rubber trees actually come from South America. And so Europeans were fascinated with this, were fascinated with natives in this first contact. They had a lot of fundamental differences over land, interpersonal relationships, and spirituality that caused a lot of tension. And then as a result of this, Europeans developed and cast these differences as, inferior, and used this as a rationalization for colonization. And this film will break this down in more detail.
In the first years of interaction between Native Americans and Europeans, there were a lot of aspects of each other's cultures that each group found, just plain weird. Europeans and Native Americans looked, dressed, and thought differently in fundamental ways that led to misunderstandings and even violence between them. So let's take some time to compare some ways in which Native American cultural ideas differed from European cultural ideas. So how is it possible to make a direct comparison between Native American cultures and European cultures? One way is to choose a few categories of social interaction and belief and identify how each group conceived of them. Here, I've chosen ideas about land and property ownership, gender roles, and religion as areas to compare. Now, before we start, I want to put a big asterisk here and say that these are generalizations. Just as the English, French, Spanish, Dutch didn't have all exactly the same religion or concept of proper gender roles, the Algonquians, Iroquois, Pueblos, and Mississippians weren't identical either. But there were some similarities among European groups and among Native American groups that allow us to compare and contrast them more broadly. So let's start identifying these differences and exploring what effect they may have had on how the two groups perceived and interacted with each other. One major difference between Europeans and Native Americans was in their ideas about land ownership. To Europeans, land was owned by individuals and passed down through families. They had the right to fence off a plot of land and prevent trespassing. For Native Americans, land ownership was less defined and more temporary. One tribe might claim control of a hunting range, or one family might farm a plot of land for a season, but they didn't own it forever. Most land was free for everyone to use, but not to own. So when Europeans arrived, Native Americans might agree to let them farm and hunt in their territories, but they didn't expect that Europeans would then fence off that land and prevent others from using it. Likewise, Europeans were confused when Native Americans continued to use land that they thought they had purchased to own forever. Native Americans also tended to have a more communal approach to property and trade. To them, trading relationships were important, and they required a lot of feasting and gift giving to cement ties between tribes. Europeans were frequently frustrated by the amount of pomp and circumstance Native Americans demanded to complete what they saw as a simple business transaction. Partly, this had to do with how Native Americans viewed property in general. While Europeans gained high status in society by owning a lot of things and therefore being rich, Native Americans achieved high status by giving a lot of things away, being a source of riches for others. So unlike in Europe, where there were huge gaps between the rich and the poor, Native American societies were comparatively egalitarian. It was pretty rare for someone to go hungry if their neighbor had food to spare. Europeans couldn't tell if Native Americans were just naturally generous, kind people, or if they maybe just didn't get how business worked. And to Native Americans, Europeans seemed greedy and selfish, allowing others to starve and do without so that they could enrich themselves. Differences in gender roles also confused the groups. In European societies, men were the heads of household and they were in charge of outdoor labor. Women took care of the home, but they also had relatively few rights. They couldn't participate politically, own property, or get divorced. In Native American societies, men hunted and fished and conducted warfare, which often meant that they were away from home for weeks or months. Consequently, women did the farming since they were home to tend the crops. Native women also had a lot more freedom than European women. They could get divorced. They could give political advice to councils. Many Native American societies were matrilineal, so children belonged to their mother's family rather than their father's. And when a couple got married, the man moved in with his wife's family, not the other way around. To Europeans, gender roles in Native society almost seemed like they were flipped upside down. And they took this as evidence that Native people were uncivilized. To Native Americans, it looked like Europeans could barely care for themselves. They had to be taught how to farm, how to fish, even how to hunt effectively in the New World. Finally, Native and European religious practices differed, at least on the surface. Native Americans tended to believe that one great creator had made the world and that nature was imbued with spirits who would reward or punish them based on how well they took care of the land. In fact, this actually wasn't that much different from the Catholicism of Europeans who believed in a single God, but also many helpful saints. But where they differed was in exclusivity. When Europeans introduced them to Jesus and Mary and the saints, many Native Americans were happy to include them in their pantheon of helpful spirits. But this angered Europeans, who insisted on exclusive worship of the Christian God. All of these differences led to fraught interactions between Europeans and Native Americans. But despite these differences, they also adopted many useful aspects of each other's culture over time, especially in terms of trade. Native Americans were keen to get their hands on the metal implements for cooking and farming and hunting that Europeans possessed, as well as guns and horses, which were great for transportation and also for making war. Europeans were also willing to take part in the social rituals and trading rituals of Native Americans, sometimes even marrying into Native American families, so they could get access to furs hunted by Native Americans and to Native Americans as allies in their wars against rival European powers in the Americas. So, as we wrap up, I encourage you to take a closer look at this chart. Is there anything you find particularly surprising about these differences? Where do you think that Europeans and Native Americans were most likely to find common ground between them? And lastly, which of these cultural aspects do you think was the most significant difference between Europeans and Native Americans, and why?
So a couple of things that I want to
In the first years,
talk about here, especially in this more elaborate chart, is this egalitarianism that's integral to Native societies, although albeit a generalization, I think is very keen to think about. One of the things that I didn't stress probably enough earlier on, but I want to maybe mention here, is that the notion of egalitarianism that was very prevalent in Native societies also informed a lot of the ways in which resistance movements happen. And we will get into this a little bit next time. But one thing that we want to note is, Native societies were actually much more progressive politically than many Europeans that were very religiously fundamental in terms of gender roles, sexual habitations, all of those things, which I think in many ways limited their ability to be inclusive of people, and that narrow cultural and religious mindset enabled a lot of racism, right? This idea that, who gets to be valued and how enables this logic of dehumanization, right? And if we think about this in relationship to gender, the dehumanization of women happens through the religious context, right? Women are not seen as equal to men. They're not given a lot of social status, power, and privilege. And as a result, right, they are exploited or in this case, domesticated. Whereas indigenous societies were completely flipped. Women were playing a much more integral role, and that matrilinealness made it much more egalitarian. The sense that giving was very important to Native folks is also something to note, right, in terms of the way political relations are, and much of our individualism today in U.S. society actually stems in part from this European logic, whether that be theological or just capitalistic, right? And so what many Native scholars, and actually when we get into the latter parts of this unit, will share with us is that we're trying, or they are, and we should kind of go back to this indigenous way of thinking, because our central focus on individualism, on self-regulation and self-morality in many ways impedes our ability to take on more comprehensive social issues, say climate change, economics, so on and so forth, that have actually deprived many people of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness under our U.S. constitutional framework. And so we really want to be clear that the way our society is structured through this European capitalist and religious lens has actually led to the dehumanization of many people, whereas many people of color were actually practicing much more egalitarian principles in what we would now consider to be much more socially, quote unquote, progressive. So obviously this European contact ultimately leads to the demise of society. Explorers sought wealth in the New World and spices. And this thirst for wealth led to a constant invasion by European empires. Columbus comes back several times to pillage in the Caribbean. Cortez does something similar, as does Pizarro and others. The Spanish Empire took about 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver from the New World. In terms of today's money, that's about 4 billion in gold and 7 billion in silver, for obviously a grand total of $11 billion. With that, we want to also note that the theft of land from these folks also enabled slavery, and as a result, that also expanded wealth and power. And so we cannot fully comprehend the degree to which Native societies were decimated, and also the amount of wealth stolen from these folks over time, given that through this destruction, we now have such increased poverty, and we also have new global superpowers. So we want to be clear, or we want to also consider that if we're having conversations about reparations, what this actually looks like, and also what would indigenous societies even look like without European contact. Maybe we would have a whole different life way in the Americas that could have been much more politically progressive, egalitarian, so on and so forth, right? Because specifically this invasion led to a 90% decline in Native peoples, right? So 116 million down to 11.6 million people, right? So that's huge. And we actually have seen the extinction of peoples, of languages, of spiritual beliefs, so on and so forth, which is a huge loss, right? We revel in the sense of the extinction of animal species. We've actually had the extinction of human cultures, right? And so we really want to be clear what has been the devastating impact of European conquest on this. And it doesn't necessarily stop here, as we'll see in future lectures. This is only the beginning of the destruction, right? So with that, we've covered a lot. We've covered Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere, the origins of peoples in the America, Native civilizations, examples again of indigenous architecture and communities, the interconnection between Native peoples, those scientific advancements from these communities, and then first contact with Europe, and then what that actually led to, which was the decline of Native societies. Granted, this is a brief overview, and I didn't want to overwhelm you with a lot of information, although this probably seems like a lot, but please always feel free to ask questions, email me if you have anything else. Our key term for today, again, is anachronistic. With that, I will let you all go. Thank you for tuning in, and email me if you have any questions.